So our goal today is to carry on looking at the life and thought of two figures. It's very interesting to put these two figures together because they live in completely different parts of the world. Their lives overlap somewhat, but one is 40 years younger than the other, and yet there's no way of separating them because they remarkably co-author this work from two different regions. Over time and space, this joint work is written. So I'd like to do today really is try and finish off talking about the life of Rabbi Yosef Caro, and then talk about the life of the Ramah. And then next week, hopefully, we'll look at their philosophy and obviously particularly their legal philosophy because they are halachists. That's their claim to fame. But they also differ and have very interesting different philosophical, Kabbalistic, hashkafic views of the world. I was asked last week, at the end of last week, by two people, actually, neither of whom are here this morning, but hopefully they'll hear the recording. If that's you, you know who you are. So actually one of them is online, I see, to speak about two things before I move on. One is some of the interesting characters that I mentioned that Rabbi Yosef Karo met and had influence on him. And secondly, a little bit about why his work was so successful. Now, we will look more at why his work was successful as we understand the figure of the Ramah, who's a significant part of that story. But very briefly, let me just speak about a few aspects of Rabbi Yosef Karo's life that we only touched on. The first is the remarkable figure of Shlomo Molcho. I mentioned him last week. I said that Rabbi Yosef Karo can only really be understood if he's seen as a product. So much of his life story reflects the era of history in which he lives, in which he is a Spanish/Portuguese refugee from the terrible trauma that Sephardic Jewry undergoes in the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula, and the seismic shift in the whole sort of worldview and nature of the whole Jewish world, and in particular particularly the Sephardi world, it's massive. There's no way to underestimate this. And Rabbi Yosef Karo lives very much with this awareness of himself as a part of a traumatized group of people. Later we'll see that perhaps one of the reasons for the success of the Shulchan Aruch is because of this massive shift in Jewish life at the time. But part of his project, though, is linked to his refugee status, his status of being having to move from place to place. He sees a need to write his halachic work because the era of the Rishonim has come to an end, largely because of this disjoint in Jewish history of the Spanish expulsion in the Sephardi world and the migration of Ashkenazim eastwards into Poland in the Ashkenazi world, which we'll come to when we talk about the Ramah. So there's been this rupture in the sort of chain of tradition, in a sense. He lives with Kabbalah. The Sephardi world retreats. It was already retreating from the 1300s from philosophy. Okay, thank you. It already retreats significantly. But the builders here today, or okay. No, it's okay. No, I'm grateful to Simon. I'm just okay. It's like, well done. Okay, so the Sephardi world retreats from philosophy. It's already been retreating from philosophy from the 1300s, but with the Spanish expulsion, it retreats headlong from philosophy and never really gets back to it, certainly Eastern Sephardim. And Rabbi Yosef Karo reflects that. He's a Kabbalist. Some of his projects are explicitly linked to the rise of Kabbalah, to the mystical need to create a tikkun post-expulsion. One of the reasons they want to restore smicha, the authentic chain of ordination, is in order to bring tikkun to the souls of Moranos, those who had converted. And I mentioned Rabbi Yosef Karo's fascination with martyrdom. He meets the figure of Shlomo Molcho, who dies through martyrdom, and I'll tell you about Shlomo Molcho in a minute. I mentioned him briefly, but I'll say a little more about him. He davens that he should be privileged to die the life of a martyr in his mystical experiences, which we discussed, where he has this angelic revelation, the Maggid, and we have this incredible work of his own records, his own diary of his own mystical experiences, the Maggid Meishorim. He writes there that he was promised that he would die a martyr's death, a promise that was never fulfilled. So this is very much part of his life. Let's just talk about a couple of instances that connect to this, and then I want to move on to Rabbi Yosef Caro. So the figure of Shlomo Malcha, as I mentioned, he is born in Portugal. He's a descendant of Marrano parents. Someone said to me last week I shouldn't be using this term Marrano because it's an insulting term and so on, and that is correct. But I'm just using it as a shorthand because it's a convenient way. We could call them conversos or other terms. Either way, becomes a Baal Teshuvah and becomes a superb Talmid Chacham. There's no doubt about that. He was a mystic. He goes deep into mysticism. He wanders through the Jewish world, through Italy, through Turkey, and begins saying that a Moshiach is going to be coming. And he walks around with a flag, interestingly, with a flag that says the word Maccabi on it. And he proposed a very interesting project. He wanted to establish a Jewish Christian army to go and reconquer Eretz Yisrael. And eventually, as you can imagine, he's there in Italy. He's meeting kings and popes, and eventually he's arrested in Italy and as a heretic, because of course technically he was a Christian. He was born a Christian, and once a Christian, always a Christian from their perspective, and therefore he's arrested as a heretic, and he's told either be burned at the stake or return to your Christian heritage, and he refuses and he dies. And as I mentioned, Rabbi Yosef Karo is very, very moved by that story and very impressed by it. So that's one key figure that I briefly touched upon. A second figure that I briefly touched upon is the figure of the Nasi family. So this is I mentioned the Rabbi Yosef Nasi, who is a nephew of Donna Gracia Mendes. She is Nasi. Very briefly, the Nasi family or the Mendes family are a family of Spanish refugees who, like many refugees, succeed in enormously creative. They make an absolute fortune. They find shelter, as do many of the Spanish refugees, under the Ottomans. They are a court Jew in the sense that they go very close to the Malchus, to the Ottoman emperor, and become a senior advisor, and eventually buy up enormous tracts of land. In a way sort of mirroring what maybe 200 years later the Rothschild family are going to do. And they are part of the project of creating the free zone, the economic free zone that I mentioned last week in Sfat, which is what allows the flourishing of the Sfat community. So we're talking about figures here in the 1500s. Again, born Moranos in Portugal and escape to the free world and become business people, diplomats, and political figures, and resettling of Eretz Yisrael. So they're involved in a project resettling of Eretz Yisrael. Maybe one day we can look at the history of the resettlement of Eretz Yisrael, but this idea that sort of nothing happens until the 1900s is obviously inaccurate historically, and this is a proto-attempt to resettle Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yosef Caro is involved in a terrible controversy connected to that family, in which the agent of the family breaches the trust they put in him. So the family have a senior agent who's responsible for channeling large parts of their money, and the senior agent decides that he wishes to take some of the money and reports them, libels them to the Ottoman Empire, and he's involved in dealing with that mess also. So his power is very significant. I think I mentioned last week there's a Din Torah in France, far, far away in France, in which there's a dispute between a community and its leaders about the tax rates and how taxes are distributed. In those days, very often the government would impose a collective tax on a community. So they would say to a community, you have to come up with X every year, and then the community leaders would decide how they would allocate it. So do you allocate it as a per capita tax per head? Do you allocate it based on wealth? Do you allocate it based on income? All of these are going to make a difference as to how the tax burden is shared. If it's a per head, then everyone rich and poor has to pay the same amount. If it's per wealth, then someone who's a property owner pays more than someone who isn't. If it's per income, and so on. So there's always, unfortunately and sadly, disputes between communities about how the tax burden is distributed, and he's involved in a court case about that. So you see the extent of his power. The final person I want to talk about is very interesting because it shows us something about Rabbi Yosef Caro's Kabbalistic leanings or anti-philosophical views. And this is another very, very interesting figure, Rabbi Azariah di Rossi, or Azariah min ha-Edomim. So we're talking about someone whose life more or less overlaps with Rabbi Yosef Caro, born in 11, dies in 1578. Italian figure, as you can probably tell from his name, and his name is an allusion to the fact that he's living there in Edom, in Italy, right? Italy is associated, Rome is associated with Edom, Azarodim and Hadomim. He again is an enormous scholar, and then he writes a work called Ma'or Einayim, lighting up the eyes. And basically, it's an unprecedented work in that era of Jewish history. And he looks at Agadah, Midrashim of Chazal, many of which have perhaps been taken as literal. And he says these can't be understood literally, they have to be understood in some other way because they are ahistorical. He studies history. Don't forget, he's living in the 1500s, where in Italy there's a burgeoning rediscovery of the classical tradition. He's meeting classical historicity. He challenges Agadah, and he also challenges not just sort of midrashic Agadah, like sort of very strange tales, which perhaps everyone could understand as metaphoric, but he even challenges the historical timeline that Chazal understood. Those of you who've been going to my Nehemiah shir will know that I spent the first two shiurim perhaps too much time discussing the timeline of Ezra and Nehemiah and issues around the dating of those books and Chazal's conflation of different historical figures like Koresh and Dayavesh and so on. And discuss that at length. I'm not going to go through that. But based on secular records, when I say secular, I don't mean secular, I mean based on Persian records and Greek records and Egyptian records at the time, based on some archaeological evidence and so on, there is an argument to be made that Chazal's timeline is 160 plus years off. And again, I'm not going to go through the wrongs and rights of that argument, and is that legitimate to question or not legitimate to question? I mentioned Rishon Schwab has an essay on it, and so on. This remains a raging controversy in the Jewish world to this day. But basically, we use the dates of a midrashic halachic work called Seder Olam, ascribed to a Tana, no less, to Rabbi Yosef, and that's pretty much sets the timeline of Jewish history. And the first, to the best of my knowledge, to become aware of the massive contradiction between Persian, Greek, Egyptian chronology and Jewish tradition of chronology is this Rabbi Azaria de Rossi. So he's a very, very important figure, and he gets attacked, and he's accused of using, this new scientific method of learning Torah. His work is accused of being heretical. Another figure who we haven't yet had a look at, but maybe we will, and will feature a little bit in today's discussion of the Ramah, is the Maharal Miprag. The Maharal Miprag attacks the Ma'or Einayim, writes a whole work against him, and a cherem is issued against the Ma'or Einayim and Rabbi Azaria de Rossi, and Rabbi Yosef Caro is consulted, and he agrees with those who wish to propose excommunication. So Rabbi Yosef Caro now joins the ranks of a very, very long tradition of a divide between the Kabbalists and the philosophers, and the Mekubalim seeing a heretical danger in trying to study and align and narrow Chazal to fit into contemporary scientific understanding. And Rabbi Yosef Karo commissions one of his Talmidim, to draw up the text of a cherem, and then Rabbi Yosef Karo dies. He never signs the cherem, and Azaria de Rossi is never actually technically put in cherem, at least not by worldly. The local Rabbonim in Mantua in Italy put him in cherem, but that's just a local cherem. And I suppose in an event of divine hashgacha, he isn't actually put into full cherem, as it were. There's no international Jewish, Klal Yisrael-wide cherem. And his works slowly become relearned. I don't think his Ma'or Einayim ever becomes a classic. He ends up as a corner of the Jewish world, but nonetheless, he is Nonetheless, he is quoted, and later poskim give him covered. So he's quoted as Nesher HaGadol, the great eagle. He's quoted by the Shach and others. So even though his philosophical works remain controversial to this day, nonetheless, he doesn't actually get put into cherem by Rabbi Yosef Karo, and that has an effect on the rest of history. By the way, his name resurfaces in the 20th and 21st century, when I don't want to go into modern day politics or anything like that, other than there was when was this? In the 2000s, somewhere in the year 2005, 2006, there was a series of letters signed against Natan Slifkin, with whom many of you may be familiar with. At the time, he was a young Talmud Chacham who controversially engaged in relooking at Chazals and Psukim based upon science. And again, I'm not going to go into the wrongs and rights of what happened there and everything else, and there remains disparate views. But those who attack him and his works make explicit reference to the Maral versus Rabbi Azaria de Rossi, Azaria min Adomim, Rabbi Azaria de Rossi, and both sides sort of compare themselves to the two sides in this debate. So it's very interesting how themes run through. Now, again, Azaria de Rossi is a sort of world-class rabbinic figure, but nonetheless, it's interesting how this remains a sort of sensitive point in Jewish history to this day. Okay, that finishes what I want to say about the life of Rabbi Yosef Karo. All I want to do in a moment is discuss briefly how come the Shulchan Aruch became such a massive success, and then I really want to move on to the Ramah, who will be our focus. Sorry, yes.
I follow the subsequent views which they brought where he considered controversial as it was.
Nowadays, I would say everyone would consider him controversial to this time. At the end of the day, anyone, small or big, who is questioning Chazal, and again, I don't think anyone will have a problem if there's a medrash that says something clearly very strange, very mysterious, in saying, okay, did this historically happen? And the Maral does that, right? That isn't controversial. However, taking the historical timeline, for example, or taking things that Chazal assume to be scientific and factual, and saying that needs to be questioned based upon current understanding of science, and certainly doing that through relearning Psukim and the like, there's no suffix that that's controversial, and that's going to remain controversial probably forever in Jewish history. There's always going to be a spectrum of Jewish thoughts, broadly speaking, into two camps. One of which says Chazal knew what they were saying. Science is always a degree speculative, and therefore we can't use that to sort of re-change how we look at things. And the other camp will say science is empirical, therefore we need to relook at how Chazal or the Psukim are to be understood. And then a range of views in the middle. That remains controversial to this day. And I'd say Rabbi Azaria de Rossi's direct impact, in a sense, has been very minimal. How many people have even heard of him? How many people have learned his sefer? Very, very few. It remains a niche topic, but the truth is all these topics remain niche. Most of our relationship to Yiddishkeit is around halacha and hashkafa and trying to live and be decent Jews. And the reality behind things, okay, we'll leave to experts. We're neither scientists nor Talmidei Chachamim where we're going to get sort of too caught up in it. But in a sense, a significant part of some of the shiurim I've given over time, where we looked at Torah and evolution and the like, have been part of that genre. And that's always going to be there's always going to be controversy around how that works and how to deal with it.
I don't know if you remember. I'm losing my voice. Whether he established the Tikkun Shavuos.
Yes, I mentioned it last week very briefly. Yes, yeah. Very briefly, his mystical work, the Magen Yesharim, is linked to that, and we have reports of some of them. I mentioned last week also an incredible report. I was going to go through it today, but I won't because I want to move on. But you can find it online, a report of a Yemenite traveler who actually describes him functioning as a Rosh Yeshiva, sitting there giving shir, 200 Talmidim around. He describes so we have a first-hand report of someone who witnessed Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was an Av based in. He was a posek, not just a posek, the posek of the 1,000 years, the author of the primary halachic works, and also functioning Rosh Yeshiva and a mystic. So a man of so many areas in Torah and achievements is just phenomenal. Why was his Shulchan Aruch so successful, I was asked? Why was it more successful than the Rambam? So a number of reasons. We will look at some of these in more detail later when we understand his legal philosophy and his relationship to the Ramah. But very briefly, the Rambam, I'd say a number of distinctions. The first is the Rambam is writing his own view in his work. So the Rambam is going through Shas and the Gaonim, and he is compiling a halachic work based upon how Moshe ben Maimon, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon, understands Kol HaTorah Kula, the whole Torah, which means that it's always going to have to convince everyone that it's completely true if it's going to become the classic halachic work, and it never does so. As influential as the Rambam is, no one agreed with everything he said. There's whole other schools of thought. The Rambam ignores Rashi, he ignores the Bali Tosfos, he certainly ignores those who follow him, the Rashba and the Ramban and the Ritva. So it's the Rambam's own view of of Judaism that becomes a pillar of halacha, but never the pillar of halacha, never the foundation of halacha, because it's one person's view. The Rambam hoped that wouldn't be the case. The Rambam wrote his work. He writes in his Akdama, that's it. I've tidied up the whole of Shas. I've tidied up the whole of halacha, and now you've got everything here. Like that's all sorted out. He doesn't know that his work is going to generate voluminous scholarship, but certainly isn't going to end the conversations around halacha. So that's the first reason the Rambam is less successful, because the Rambam is writing his own view. Contrast that to Rabbi Yosef Caro, who is trying to do something very different. First of all, he's trying to, in an encyclopedic manner, compile and bring together everything everyone has said before him. I think I mentioned last week his Hakdama, in which he lists 32 Rishonim that he's trying to integrate, and there's actually many more. The sheer magnificence of Beis Yosef, of his pre-Shulchan Aruch work. Very briefly, just to remind ourselves, he writes many works, but the two works that we're interested in here from a halachic point of view are Beis Yosef, which is an encyclopedia of halacha structured around the Torah, and then his summary of the Beis Yosef, which is his actual bottom line psak halacha, which is his Shulchan Aruch. His Beis Yosef summarizes every sugya from start to finish, from Mishnah to Gemara, from Pasuk to Mishnah to Gemara, to all the legal work that he could get his hands on, in an incredible manner, to accumulate that amount of information and juggle it and sort it out. We're talking about one of the finest legal minds of a millennium. It's phenomenal. It's unimaginable how someone could achieve that. And to the best of our knowledge, there's no research team involved. In others, we spoke about other figures. We did have a research team with Rabbi Karo. He was just a one in a 1,000-year figure. And he compiles all of that into this incredible work and lays it all out clearly. So to this day, actually, a reasonably learned person can open a page of Beis Yosef and literally be taken through the sugya with everything sorted out and everything summarized and just beautifully structured. It's just a pre-encyclopedia era encyclopedia. It's just absolutely amazing. Yeah.
That we set out to
we will come to that. What is the Shulchan Aruch? But basically, Rabbi Karo definitely didn't see the Shulchan Aruch as his main work. In many ways, it's Beis Yosef's main work. He wrote the Shulchan Aruch so that people can briefly see a summary of halacha. It is a type of suck in that he does summarize his halachic conclusion. He wrote it, as I mentioned, divided it into 30 parts and wanted everyone to learn it every month. So you'd have a sort of daf yomi of Shulchan Aruch, where every 30 days you would complete the whole of Shulchan Aruch. Not that achievable for most of us, and that way everyone would know all of halacha. So it was, but he never saw it as he didn't want people to learn that as his premier work. Okay, but returning to our matter, why is it so successful? Because he's trying to integrate everything that everyone said. In a sense, he's trying to be a bit invisible. He's not trying to say his own view. He's trying to summarize everything everyone has said, and then say to people, look, I'm going to present you a few principles of halachic pasak. Let's apply these principles to all these 32 or more views that I've summarized, and we'll come out with a clear halachic conclusion. So in a certain way, many Boti Medrash can feel at home in Rabbi Yosef Karo. Many schools of thought can feel we've had our chance to talk. We've been extensively analysed. All our rebbes and teachers are mentioned, and now the posek of all time has tried to draw a halachic conclusion from it. So that's one reason why it's so successful. It's less about him and more about his reading of earlier sources and drawing out practical halacha. That's reason number one. By the way, the titles he's given reflect these different roles. He's sometimes referred to as moron. When you learn a halachic work, particularly a Sephardi halachic work, and moron means the teacher. When moron it's an Aramaic version of moreno, our teacher, and so on, from hara, to teach. When the teacher is quoted, that is Rabbi Yosef Karo. Who else in history is known just as the rabbi? Not the Rambam, no. Not Moshe Rabbeinu is Moshe Rabbeinu. Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, the compiler of the Mishnah, for in a way similar reasons. In a sense that this is the greatest code since the Mishnah Torah is often compared to the Mishnah, and the Rambam liked to think that the Mishnah Torah would be another Mishnah. The problem with the Rambam is he only brings his own view. What does Rabbi Yehuda Nossi do? He brings all the views, right? Or many of the views. Every Mishnah is full of multiple views, and he indicates through various ways what he thinks should be the halacha, but it doesn't always tie up the halacha. So Rabbi Yehuda Nossi is known in Jewish history as Rebbe, or Rabbeinu, right? Whenever the Gemara quotes Rebbe, unannounced, just the rabbi, without any title, that's Rabbi Yehuda Nossi. So in a sense, Moran, the Rabbi Yosef Karo, achieves similar status. The other title he's given is Mechaber. Now, last week I called him Mechaber the author. I said he is the author. But that's a mistranslation. What's the etymology of the word Mechaber? Chibur. Chibur means compilation. He's the compiler, or the editor, you can call him. So he's a compiler. He's the Mechaber. He's the compiler of all compilers. He compiles everything there is to know about halacha. into this magnificent, incredible work, and publishes. So that's the second reason I think he becomes so dominant. The third reason is because he's I want to be careful here, but in a way, I want to say he's a less original or creative figure in a sense than the Rambam. There's a creativity in not being as original, meaning he sets himself this task of compiling everything everyone has ever said and then drawing out halachic conclusion from it. That's an incredible achievement. But in a sense, he's less original than the Rambam. As I said, his own voice is a little less there. The Rambam, when you learn the Rambam, you meet the Rambam. When you learn Rabbi Karo, you meet everyone else. And then you see how he applies rules, in a sense, almost algorithmically, in a way. I want to unpick this more later, and I don't mean Chassidus just to say it's like, he's just mathematically applying rules. But in a sense, almost algorithmically, he's applying halachic rules, and he arrives at a halachic conclusion based upon how he understands halacha should work. He's got a philosophy of halacha, of course, how he thinks psak should work, and then he gives that psak. So he's less controversial in the sense, and also he's better matched to the feeling of his time. And the Rambam is an originator of this concept of a structured work in that way. By the time Rabbi Yosef Caro comes out, in other words, till the Rambam, when you wanted to do halacha, you learned Gemara, and then you wrote a commentary on Gemara. And someone needed to paskin, they would learn Gemara, and then they would find all the commentaries, and they would come to halachic conclusion. The Rambam tidies it all up, so everything is arranged. If you want to know Shabbos, you look in the Rambam and Hilchos Shabbat. You learn the Hilchos Shabbos of the Rambam. If you want to know from Gemara the halacha of Shabbos, you have to learn Shabbos, but you also have to learn Eruvin and Megillah and Yoma and Beitzah, and maybe there'll be an odd Gemara in Baba Metzia that talks about the laws of Shabbos. The Rambam has compiled and tidied everything up. By the time Rabbi Yosef Karo comes along, this is already a well-established genre. Everyone is doing this, so it's easier for him. And also, of course, he doesn't have the whole controversy around his philosophical views. He's a Kabbalist, fitting in with a Kabbalistic genre, living in Safat, rubbing shoulders with all the Kabbalists. I mentioned figures associated with him, his teachers, his students, the Alshich and Shlomo Alkabetz, and he's a contemporary of the Arizal and Chaim Vital, and he's very much part of the establishment. I believe he's actually a mechutin with Arizal. I think his son marries Arizal's daughter. So he's very much part of the now dominant school of Jewish thought. There's still pockets of resistance from philosophical thinking. We mentioned Rabbi Azaria de Rossi, but basically Rabbi Karo doesn't attract controversy particularly for his philosophical or Kabbalistic views, though his revolution in halacha definitely does. And here we come to the next reason why he's so phenomenally successful, because he gets backing from a towering figure called Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, who we will come on to shortly. The final reason I think he's so successful is because to be successful, you need to be the right man at the right time, the right person at the right time. And he is the right person at the right time. The world is ready for compilation now. Why is the world ready for compilation? Because when the Rambam writes, people still see themselves as being able to go back to primary sources. If you're a Talmud Chacham living in the life of the Rambam, or even for a couple of hundred years afterwards, how do you wish to learn? You go to the Gemara and you try and learn the Gemara. So the Rashba, the Ramban, the Ritva, Meiri, all figures that follow the Rambam, all say, we're not just going to sort of listen to the Rambam's psak, we're going to learn Gemara ourselves and come to our own conclusions. Of course, we are members of a yeshiva, of a Beit HaMedrash, we receive from our teachers, but we still see ourselves as capable of original thought, of ab initio, from the first instance, learning primary sources, learning Gemara and seeing what the Gemara says and drawing out halacha. Around Rabbi Yosef Karo's time, the era of the Rishonim is deemed to have come to an end. In other words, our job is no longer to try and learn Gemara in our own creative way, but our job is to try and learn how others have learned it and then examine that in more detail and understand that better. And that's the onset of the era of the Achronim. Why is this time ripe for that? A number of reasons. Firstly, it's a time, as I mentioned, of rupture in Jewish history. The Sephardi world has gone through its macro trauma of expulsion from Spain and relocation to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East, Israel, and so on and so forth. The Ashkenazi world has gone through a less serious one-off rupture, but a series of perhaps 2 centuries of micro ruptures, in which basically the Western Ashkenazi world of Germany and North France have gone into decline. What's caused this? Well, as far back as the Crusades, it's been stage 1, but then there's been ever more persecution. We mentioned the figure of the Maram of Rottenburg, who's arrested. His student, Rabbeinu Osher, the Rosh, runs away to Spain. So Ashkenazim have to run away from the heartlands of Ashkenaz, and of course the largest population of Ashkenazim run away eastward to Poland, which welcomes them at this point with open hands. And in the Ashkenazi world, in a sense, the era of Rishonim has come to an end, perhaps even 100 years before the era of the end of the Rishonim in the Sephardi world, because of this persecution. So basically what happens when people have to run away and the chain of tradition is broken somewhat? A number of things happen. First of all, people lose confidence in their ability to continue doing what their predecessors have, because they're aware there's been a dramatic rupture. Secondly, they turn to written texts. The Mishnah takes off because of Roman persecution. Gemara takes off finally in its final version because of the decline of Bovel to some degree. And the Rishonim end because of rupture in these two Ashkenazi Sephardi ruptures. If we think about our own times, for example, post-Holocaust, there's been a seismic shift in how we see ourselves in the sort of texts we turn to. We no longer have works like Chasam Sofer or Chaim Brisker being written. In a sense, where do we turn? We turn to the Mishnah Berurah, like a modern-day Rabbi Yosef Karo type work, a modern-day encyclopedic compilation. I don't want to link each era of history too much. There's always differences also, but there's some parallels, and Rabbi Yosef Karo finds himself as the right person at the right time. Klal Yisrael is receptive to receiving a new code of Jewish law, and it's useful. It fits the needs of the time. Yeah.
That he was at the same time that printing was.
That also helps massively. So yeah, thank you. I should have mentioned that printing also very significant. And Rabbi Yosef Karo, by the way, he's not just reflecting the time, but in a sense, there's a feedback loop here. Had his work not been written and had no one else written such a work, maybe we would have had to continue learning Gemara as we've shown him. But the work itself, in a sense, triggers the possibility of that change. So people are ripe for change. They're ripe for a code of Jewish law, and they're ready for a code of Jewish law, but itself that allows the transition of an era to occur. Now, do I have any evidence for this theory that people are ready for a code of Jewish law, that there's something about the times? Or maybe this is just a great figure who arises and manages to pull it off. What about my thought experiment? Had Rabbi Yosef Karo not written his code of Jewish law, what would have happened? And the answer is we know very well what would have happened, because it is only one of many codes of Jewish law that are written in that era. It ends up being the most successful, and in a minute we'll discuss again in more detail why. Again, the figure of the Ramah looms very largely in this. But there are others who realize that the times need a similar project, and many others step forward to create such a similar work. And this leads us neatly into the personage of the Ramah. So we are now, ladies and gentlemen, please make a dramatic shift with me. We are moving thousands of miles all the way from warm, hilly Tzfat to cold, gloomy Krakow, and we're going to learn the Ramah, who is the co-author of the Shulchan Aruch, and in many ways almost a twin of Rabbi Yosef Karo in a remarkable way. And we're going to look at his life and his achievements and see how the two end up together. Yes. Yes.
Whether there could be a reflection of what's going on in the wider world, the Renaissance.
Yes.
In terms of talking about things in a more ordered structure.
Okay, this is a very good question. The whole sort of Renaissance and ordered, structured manner and the like. That is true, but that's happened earlier already in the Jewish world. In other words, the Rambam is part of that, the whole revolution of the Rambam and so on. I'll come maybe a little bit back to a link of that, but I think that's already happened earlier. I would put that down under the groundwork, and I mentioned that codification has been taking place for hundreds of years before Rabbi Yosef Karo. So he's not the originator of the concept of codification, but he is the originator of this form of codification, this accumulation of everything that's happened before, or near originator, now quite a little bit of an exaggeration. Okay, so let's shift to the Ramah and try and understand his life. He's born in 1530 in Krakow in the Kingdom of Poland, dies in 1572 in Krakow in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Quick check of history. Are there two Krakows, one in the Kingdom of Poland, one in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? How come he's born in Krakow in the Polish Kingdom and dies in the Okay, famous phenomena of European life. You can live in the same shtetl your whole life, be born there, live there, and die there, and be the citizen, and move country 5 times in the process, right? That's European life. There's a constant shifting. It's very, very unstable political time. And in the Ramah's lifetime, it shifts from being the Kingdom of Poland to a merger between Poland and Lithuania, and so on. I'm not going to go into any of the world history at the time. I'll leave that to historians to do. Okay, so the Ramah is born in 1530. He dies in 1572. He's aged 42. Note, just in terms of the overlap with his life of the Beis Yosef, the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, is born in 1488. So quick maths, he is 40 years older than, is that right? 1488, so that's 90, 30, 30, 42 years older than the Ramah. He dies in 1575, 3 years after the Ramah. So the Beis Yosef Rabbi Yosef has a long life, 87 years. The Ramah has a short life, 42 years. And he's 40 years younger than the Rabbi Yosef Caro, normally indicating 2 generations younger in terms of influence. And yet the two from afar are aware of each other, correspond with each other, and are enormously impressed by each other. They're kindred spirits. Their minds work in similar ways. Let's just do a little bit of history over here to understand the background, both in terms of the Ramah's life and what he's doing in faraway Poland. So very briefly, the settlement of Poland. As I mentioned, Poland is founded with the decline of Germany. German Jews begin moving eastward. I'll give rough dates just to give you a sense of the timeline. Jews begin settling in Poland probably in small numbers around the year 1100 or so on. But basically, it's only in the mid-1200s that Jewish immigration begins picking up a little bit. Some of the key things that trigger Jewish immigration, the trauma of the Mongol invasion. Poland needs to rebuild its economy. It wants a middle class to move in. Famously, Jews are useful for that. Mid-1300s, Poland has a dynamic and creative king known as Casimir the Great, Casimir, and he invites Jews in more. So Jewish population begins building up. Again, I suppose the closest parallel we can think of is America's. It has trickles of Jews coming in from the 1700s, but the massive population explosion in maybe the late 1800s. But in that time, it doesn't become a Torah center. It takes the next wave of immigrants to make it into a Torah center. So similarly, there's nothing much interesting Jewishly going on in the 1300s in Poland. There's Jews living there, but there's no major Jewish scholarship of which we are aware. And then roughly from 1350s to 1500s, there's mass immigration and more senior Rabbonim begin moving over. And a bit like America, the first generation of rabbinic leadership are all European educated, but then America begins producing its own Gedolim. So similarly, Poland, the first generations are all Ashkenaz educated, as in German and perhaps Austria educated. And eventually they begin generating their own home Torah. And around the year 1500, I think we can say they've reached maturity. They are a massive population with yeshivas, with poskim, with Talmidei Chachamim, with political influence. The Vard Arba Arotzos, for example, they're granted a sort of mini parliament that meets several times a year and is made up of rabbis and lay leaders and business people, and they have some degree of autonomy in the rulership of Polish Jewry. And the rest is history, as it were, 1500s and on. Polish Jewry goes through enormous periods of wealth and growth. For hundreds and some years, it's very peaceful. They're very respected, and then there's the traumas of Tachlotat, the Chmielewski massacres. Big debate how traumatic it is or it isn't. And then again, there's a peaceful era, and then obviously it goes through an enormous population explosion, and so much happens until it comes to its end in the Holocaust. So this is a very brief synopsis of Polish life, largely founded by Jews who think of themselves as Ashkenazim, migrating from Germany and Austria. There remains a little bit of debate as to whether there's significant immigration from elsewhere or not, but certainly culturally they somehow see themselves as descendants. They call themselves Ashkenazim, and they see themselves as descendants of German Jewry, culturally at least, and they speak Yiddish, this German Jewish, eventually German Jewish Slavic tongue, and they say we're Ashkenazim. That's what we are. So this is the enormous Ashkenazi population now in East Europe. And of course, it begins going its own way to some degree, and that's why we have Polish minhagim that differ from German minhagim, and so on and so forth. Okay. The generation before the Ramah has a number of significant scholars, none of whom, unless someone's a historian has made an effort to hear of them, none of whom any of us have heard about. These are not known figures. They're known amongst certain niche study circles, Talmidei Chachamim, and certain niche historians, but we don't have anything directly from them. But they are the teachers of the next generation of Polish scholars, with whom there's an explosion. There's suddenly a massive array of household names that everyone's heard of, and we would call that the first generation of Polish leadership that sort of hits international fame. So let's just mention some of the names of the founding. This is a bit of a misquote, but the first generation of Polish leaders who are very, very prominent, but we haven't heard of. I'll mention two figures. One is Rabbi Yaakov Polak. Show of hands, people heard of him? Rabbi Yaakov Polak. We've got a historian over here. Second is, okay, so we've got three people here. Reb Sholem Shachna. I'm delighted I have an educated audience over here. Okay, so not household names by any means. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but what I would say is, tell me one piece of Torah from them, right? So maybe we just know their names. Maybe a mazumman of people know their names. Torah from them, no one knows anything directly. They didn't write, by the way. They weren't writers. They didn't publish. They taught. They were Roshei Yeshivas. And then they have the next generation where everyone's heard of them. The Ramah, who's our subject of conversation, and Moshe Isserles. But you also have Reb Shlomo Luria, the Marshal, better known as the Marshal. You have the Maral, who I already mentioned, and Maral's brother, who's a little less known, Rabbi Chaim. We have Reb Mordechai Yoffe, the next generation, Reb Mordechai Yoffe, the students of the Levushla. We have the Sma, Rabbi Shua Falk. We have the father of the Shla, we have the teacher of the Bach. So we have like a whole array of figures who are just so well known and famous and have such impact on sort of contemporary Jewish learning. So I'll take your comment in a moment. Just to summarize, all I'm really saying is we're looking here very briefly at three generations of Polish leadership. We're looking at, we can call them almost the founding generation of Polish scholarship, who we barely know anything about. Roshei Yeshivas, Rabbi Yaakov Polak, Rabbi Shachna, and the next generation who are, I'm merging a bit generations, but the next generation who are the Ramah's generation and his students, who are household names in the Torah world, as Poland has reached maturity and is ready to step forward into the forefront of Jewish communities across the world, and perhaps in some ways becomes the most prominent Jewish community in the world. Sorry.
What the Hasidic did?
Later, much later. Well, I say much later. They're actually closer in time than we realize, but 100 years later. Yeah, the earliest Hasidic teachers are sort of students of students. It's not an enormous gulf in time, but from a historical point of view, a very different Poland that they arrive in. Very different world, post the Tach massacres and things like that. So post the Chmielnicki massacres and very, very different environment. So the Hasidim are not yet on the scene at all in this era that we're talking about. Okay, so I hope that gives you sort of some sense of the lay of the land. I want to mention now, before we come to Ramah's life directly, I just want to talk a little bit about derech halimud and style of learning. The founding generation of Polish teachers are associated with a style of learning known as pilpul. Pilpul is complex, is elaborate. It's very far from pshat and halacha l'maisa. Basically, when you learn, and it's in Gemara, by the way, we're only talking in legalities here. So those of you who remember not that long ago, we were talking about Rashi. There we were talking about pshat in terms of learning Tanakh and so on. I'm talking about here within legal texts. So you learn Gemara. What do you discover when you learn Gemara? So you find conversations taking place across Boti Medrash. They are free flow. They are unsystematic. It's organic. It's very stimulating. It's subtle. It's clearly very, very fine minds. I don't need my approval, obviously, clearly very, very nuanced legal thinking. And Gemara often is very open-ended. It doesn't really try and get to a halachic conclusion. Gemara doesn't even demand consistency always. You'll have records of conversations that take place in different yeshivas and sometimes recorded in different tractates, different mesechtas, and the Gemara won't necessarily worry about how they align and how they fit in, and it won't systematically try and lay out every scenario and every distinction. It's this incredibly vibrant, lively, energetic. When you learn Gemara, you just are drawn into this energetic, vibrant conversation taking place in the Beis HaMedrash. Now, if you are aiming to educate students and you see your role as a Rosh Hashiva and you're trying to found Torah in a new area, and you just want to have vibrant yeshivas, your project isn't yet that of drawing conclusions and halacha, and your project isn't necessarily even trying to say, okay, what's exactly the correct text? We've arrived from Germany with manuscripts. There's a whole manuscript mess going on. You're not going to force students to think really carefully about grammar and translation and nitty-gritty analysis of words. What happens if you try and do all of that? You bore your students silly and you don't manage to create a new vibrant Torah center. Imagine you go to yeshiva and your teacher sits down and says, okay, in order to learn Talmud, we need to understand philology and semantics and textual lamentation of manuscripts and so on and so forth. It doesn't work. So the first generation of Polish leadership are educators, they're teachers. As far as I can tell, they are perhaps aware that the Torah they're doing is not going to be immortal Torah. It's not Torah that they write down and they think all generations should have, but it's Torah they're using to generate the next generation of Jewish leadership. And they use a system called pilpul. Pilpul is spicy, it's vibrant, it's alive, it's energetic. It's looking at every Gemara and how they all fit in, and it's trying to build, and it's speculative, it's creative. It's encouraging students. Why do you think someone might say this? We're not asking you to perform rigorous proofs to convince everyone that this is the reasoning behind Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shmuel, behind Rav and Abai, behind Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. It's speculative. It's what could they be thinking? It's imaginative. What might they be doing? Does the understanding Rabbi Kiva over here, is that explained by understanding Rabbi Kiva over there, and that's explained by understanding Rabbi Kiva in the third place? It's linking, it's creating these the critics might say castles in the air, and there's some justification in this, and I'm quoting here, not my interview, I would never say this about great peoples, but the next generations that say pilpul, we can't let it go too far, but they're creating this vibrant yeshivish culture of energy and enthusiasm and creativity and so on. That is the first generation of Torah leadership. And they're not publishing, they're not writing, they paskin halachas when they need to, they're Rosh Hashivas, of course they're paskin halachas, but they're not teaching, they're not engaging in systematic, critical, halachic pasak. That's not what they're doing, they are Rosh Hashivas. The groundwork has been laid, and the next generation of leadership arise to prominence. And per echad, they have many differences, and we'll talk later about the differences between them. But all of them are now saying we need to rein pilpul in. It's time for us to get serious. We've had our playful time in Polish Jewish history. We now are the largest Jewish community in the world, perhaps. Germany has been through rupture. The Sephardi world has been through rupture. It's time for us to step forward and take ownership. And their project is boring, but enormously important. Their project is, we now need to go through Gemara and establish the correct manuscript versions, and they spend enormous time doing that. We need to go through Gemara with a fine-tooth comb and make sure we've understood the meaning of every word and every concept in it. And we need to systemize Gemara. We need to focus on Peshat, on the plain understanding of Gemara, none of this elaborate pilpul. Every piece of legal argumentation that you want to put forward has to be argued and picked and proven rigorously and methodologically. And we need to draw halacha l'maisa out of this, and arises a new leadership who are completely different to their predecessors, critical of pilpul, but not critical of their predecessors. They say our predecessors are our rebbes, but now pilpul has to stop. That's it. Gone too far. Now we need to do something else, and that is the leadership in the generation of the Ramah and the Maharshal and the Maharal and that whole realm of individuals who are flourishing in the next generation. Any thoughts or questions? Does this make sense? People are aware of this discussion around pilpul a little bit, right? Something that we talk about. To this day, pilpul is used a little bit disparagingly as it's just a piece of pilpul. Sometimes it's used in a complimentary way. A bar mitzvah boy, by the way, traditionally in East Europe, used to give a pilpul. In other words, bar mitzvah boy, he's just a little kid. We want to get him excited about Torah learning. He's not going to do Ramah-style learning. He's not going to work through manuscripts and tidy up the texts. He's not going to engage in heavy, detailed, provable legal analysis. In the Ramah's generation, you dare not say a single piece of halacha unless you have absolutely rigorous proofs for it. That's not what the bar mitzvah boy is going to do. What does he do? He does a pilpul. We want to teach him to be playful about things and sort of explore things in a playful manner. I gave a little bit of a pilpul a few weeks ago here in Shul. I spoke in the ladies series about prosthetic limbs and thought control technology and AI and so on. It's a new questions that are beginning to come along, using AI and thought control technology to do things and how halacha is going to view all of that. It wasn't a serious attempt to arrive at a halachic conclusion because the issues are still being thrashed out and probably will take several years to do so. It was, in a sense, a playful attempt at just trying to accumulate whatever sources we could find that may be relevant to this and begin seeing where they would indicate to go and so on. So I didn't use the word pilpul, but that's what I was doing. It was a playful attempt just to open up a topic and show people where conversations might begin going in this area, rather than a rigorous attempt to prove every point and arrive at a halachic conclusion. So that the bar mitzvah traditionally used to give a pilpul. The word pilpul has become used to describe different ways of learning over time, but that's basically the learning transition that takes place in that generation. Now, if all of this is too technical for you, in a sense, I make no apology, because this is meant to be a philosophy series, and one area of philosophy is legal philosophy. And we haven't really dealt with legal philosophy before, but this mini-series, is the philosophy section. It's not Rabbi, Caro and Rabbi had their own interesting philosophical views, which we'll touch upon, but their claim to fame is them as halachists. And behind every legalist, every halachist, lies a legal philosophy, whether they consciously articulate it or not. And that's the philosophy we're dealing with over here. So in a sense, we've opened up our first philosophical debate, which is how creative can law be? To what degree does it need to rigorously prove its point? And to what degree is a geschmack argument, a nice piece of reasoning, enough to establish something as having halachic basis? It's interesting, it's creative, it's thought-provoking, it's exciting, it's original. Maybe that's the basis of paskening halacha. No, the whole generation of leadership says this is absolutely not the way to go. Law, halacha, has to be rigorous and thorough and provable and arguable. Publish or die. If you don't put your stuff into writing, argue your cause, allow everyone else to attack you and defend yourself, then that's not going to be halacha. So that is the generation of the Ramah, and in a sense what they achieve, of which the Ramah is the most outstanding figure of all of that, and we'll talk about the Ramah probably next week by now a little bit more. Yes?
Is the suggestion that our generation of edicts, did not come to a conclusion built on most abstract?
Okay, so the question is does this prior generation of halachic of Rabbi and Rosh Hashivas, how are they paskin halacha, what are they doing? So I just want to make a few points. To the best of my knowledge, first of all, it's a relatively short period in Jewish history, perhaps about 60 years, that pilpul really dominates the landscape, and it dominates one part of the landscape, the new colonies of Jewish Poland, right? It's not going on in Ashkenaz in the west, which still has massive Jewish population, it's still very important, though it's losing its dominance. It's not going wrong it's going on in the Sephardi diaspora. Don't forget, the Sephardi diaspora, as much as they spread out of Spain, they're not going to virgin lands, they're not going to unsettled areas. They're spreading back into Jewish areas and taking them over. When Sephardi diaspora are running away from Spain and going either into Europe, into Northern Europe, as a few do, or into North Africa, Middle East, Eretz Israel and so on, they're not conquering virgin territory. They're arriving back and finding Jewish communities there already, with yeshivas and Tamid. But the Sephardi diaspora is so powerful and creative that it sort of conquers the area. When German Jews are moving to Poland, they're taking virgin land. They're going somewhere Jews have never really been in significant numbers. And therefore, they have this project of creating this new yeshivish world, the world of yeshivas. And but to the best of what I can see, it's a project of about 60 years. It's about I called it one generation, but it's really 2-3 generations of leadership. And that's point number one. So it's not a lengthy time in Jewish history that pilpul dominates. Point number two, we don't know that much about them. They didn't write. They're by definition coming to new territory. And again, let's think about pre-Moshe Feinstein postskim in America. So you have Rabbi Eliezer Silver, maybe, of Cincinnati. You have, he was called the chief rabbi of New York. Remind me of his name. There's a yeshiva named Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. Yeah, he has a yeshiva named after him. We don't know anything about these figures. Right, so I mean, we know about them. They're there on in Google and Wikipedia, and we have some of their foreign, but they're much less influential. They're much less well known. The founding fathers of Polish Torah, we don't know that much about. So we have the occasional psak quoted by their students from them, and their students took them seriously as poskim. So it would seem in halacha they are doing the rigorous work. When it comes to psak, They do the rigorous work, but they're not significantly teaching that. The Torah they're interested in spreading is this creative, vibrant, spicy, energetic. I'm using the word spicy because pilpul is also linked to pepper, to the spice. Is this tangy, tasty, exciting Torah. And to the best of what I can see, they're not. We don't have evidence as to much else about what they're doing. They do a bit of drush, by the way, in a very similar style. Also very speculative, very elaborate, very fancy, beautiful, incredibly beautiful, but not rigorously. They're not interested in rigorously arguing it. Okay, we'll stop there, and I'll simply conclude by saying it is into this incredible, vibrant, exciting Ashkenazi, Eastern Ashkenazi, Polish world that the Ramah is born, and we'll talk next week about the Ramah's rise to prominence as a halachic leader, and then how he functions as a halachist vis-a-vis Rabbi Yosef Karo. I wish everyone a good day. Yes. Okay, I'm just being asked for those online about wanting to die as a martyr. It's a very interesting thing. God forbid that anyone should engineer such a situation. God forbid that one should deliberately achieve it. But is it legitimate to want to aspire to that level of submission to Hashem? We already find in the era of the Gemara such quotes, right? Rabbi Kiva and others. Kol yomai, all my days I long to be Mekayim v'ahavtas Hashem lekecha b'chol levavta v'chol nafshecha v'chol moedecha. That I should be able to give up my life in martyrdom, and now finally I've achieved it, and so on. So it seems that there's like a sensitivity and a balance of school of thought of we embrace life. We shouldn't seek out martyrdom, and yet if it confronts you, there's something very privileged and unique about being able to go that far in your sacrifice for God. So interesting tension there. Probably a bit of a debate between, again, the Kabbalists and the philosophers around these topics, but beyond the scope of this talk. I'm simply recording history, which is no less a figure than Rabbi Yosef Caro is fascinated by this concept, and that deserves to be taken seriously. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes, so next Sunday, Shivas Thomas. Excellent. Yes, yeah, it may affect time. Watch this space. I think there may even be a guest speaker next Sunday. In fact, Rav Blachman, the incredible Rav Blachman from Kerem Yavne, I have a feeling is taking the slot next Sunday. And it'll be a little bit later because of the fast, but I would encourage everyone to come to that, and then I'll resume the week after that. So, yeah. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. As always, very appreciated.